I will give a few elements, some basic reminders on epidemiological models. Here, I must make another disclaimer. The first one was, the fact that I speak only on my behalf and not on behalf of the institutions which I'm contributing to. The second disclaimer is that I'm not an epidemiologist, but I have some remnants, I would say, of some mathematics I studied when I was in préparation before entering into graduate schools. Then some network effects on the positive influence of the globalization. Third point is the adverse effects in the spreading of the pandemic, and a conclusion. As a conclusion, I would like to investigate, I would say, some realms where there is a need to adapt our legal framework. So as a starter, some basic element on the dynamic of pandemic. By the way, I think the best presentation of what a pandemic is and what is an epidemiological models can be found in the famous first book of Peyo, Les Schtroumpfs Noirs, 1963, which has been translated in English into the Purple Smurfs. Because when one of the Schtroumpf or Smurf is hit by the bee, the Smurf turns into a black Smurf, which is biting the others and spreading a sort of disease. I let you read this book to your children and also maybe to your neighbors who sometimes do not understand what a pandemic is. Very, very quickly, the most epidemiological models follow what is called a SEIR or SIR model. Where you have you segment the population into people who are susceptible to be infected, and then people who recovered. The main issue is the ratio of transformation from one stage to another, and also from one period of time to another. And the transformation is linked to what is called the basic reproductive number, usually called R0. And after the beginning of the pandemic, the infected population grows according to a geometric progression. And the sum of the terms of the progression is a geometric series. When R is superior to 1, it is rapidly diverging. Okay, and I go quickly on that. The spreading of the virus is accelerating, which is usually referred to as an exponential acceleration, until some constraints are met by the virus, and which then lead to this curve, which is called a logistic function by Pierre-François Verhulst, one of the founder of demography in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And from a health policy point of view, in a democracy, the main issue is how to cure the infected population on an equal footage, so without any discrimination, and until this population is removed from the hospital, either by recovery or, unfortunately, by death. So the constraints, as you know, lies on the intensive care units. I put the graph from a paper from the École des hautes études en santé publique in France, which was published in March 2020, showing on the red line is the amount of ICU slots in each of the French regions, and the black curves are according to free assumptions on the level of the R0. The frequency of changing from one stage to another is crucial. That is to say that the speed of the contamination within a given population is, of course, totally crucial. It's not the same thing to have, a doubling of the infected population in 10 days or in 10 months. R is the result of modeling and depends on many factors and assumptions, biological, demographical, but also social, and especially the amount of social interactions between individuals. So without cure or vaccine, lockdown is the only remaining tool to reduce R, and the intensity of social interaction is one pillar of advanced society, namely of globalization. And then you see that I make a direct linkage between the level of this factor R and some of our key element of the way our societies function. And then I would like to introduce some network effects and their positive influence in the globalization era. From the consumer's point of view, you have networks externalities. So I skip the definition. From the producer's point of view, serving a network helped to develop economies of scale and economies of scope. And these network effects lead to several economic and social phenomena. It leads to aggregation around transport network, in labor markets, and so forth. It helps division of labor between producers, between workers, but also between areas from a geographical point of view. The positive result of these network effects is huge efficiency gains, economic growth, revenue growth, and the increasing integration of more agents around networks. This is actually what happened in what is called the globalization era, and what started in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But it has a negative result. A Chinese epidemic transformed into a global pandemic. And these adverse effects can be the following. So the growing interdependency leads to more fragility and higher risks of spreading disease, and then to higher R ratio. There was an early warning, which is very interesting. It's when the WHO revised in 2005 its international health regulations, which was dating back to 1969. And this revision led to impose to each member of the WHO to build a network of points of entry. So building sort of a health, public health early warning network. And after the initial March 2020 universal lockdown, most regulation measures were targeted at reducing network effects in the transport sector, at borders, but also were targeted at large metropolises. In France, you remember that the curfew, the first curfews happened into large cities. Large cities from which, by the way, inhabitants actually fled by the thousands. So here I raise a question and would like to write a side note about the current health and sanitary regulation. Given the geometric progression and the R component, from a general public policy point of view, is it possible to negotiate with the virus or mitigate its effects with other public interest? And from a legal point of view, I'm very much puzzled by this question. Is it still possible to assess the legality of public order measures according to a proportionality test between, on the one hand, legal constraints, and on the other hand, the protection of fundamental rights and liberties, which, of course, is a very puzzling question in the present time. So there is a need to adapt whatever is our assumption as regards how the day after will look like. Either the pandemic stops in the short term and we have to draw the lessons from the crisis, or unfortunately the pandemic continues on a lower scale in the longer term and we have to invent structural measures to cope with it. And these two assumptions led to a reassessing of the network effects which developed in our advanced societies. So there is a need to reassess public policies, but also legal instruments supporting physical network and helping human beings to concentrate, of course, in transport networks and infrastructure. But as an example, I raised the issue of urban planning and zoning regulations. In France, what is called La Loi Allure Act helps concentrate population in larger cities. So this should be maybe reassessed and at least questioned. There is a need to also reassess state aid in order to relocate productions. Maybe to reassess very and numerous part of legislations up to school schedule with hybrid teaching. Or maybe the solution is going to a Colorado Canyon next to your house. And this is, once again, le lac de Serponçon. Thank you. I suggest I give the floor to Régis. And then we have a common discussion.
That's a possibility. I'm not sure if the topic are exactly the same, but I will see if it's possible to do it.
Alors, il faut présenter maintenant en bas à droite et tu
Can you see it?
L'option une fenêtre.
Are you seeing it?
Ouais, ça marche. Thank you very much.
So today I would like to address this question of the national risk culture when we are addressing the question of uncertainty and the problem of regulation under uncertainty. And why is that something that is, for me, important? Simply because if we're considering the crisis, and especially the beginning of the crisis, there were a lot of uncertainties. Some people were saying, okay, this is a virus, this is just in China, maybe in some Asian country, but it will not come in Western countries. So there was this question, will it hit as hard Western countries as Asian countries? We had no idea about the contagious characteristic of that virus. It was also very difficult to know whether or not it was something that was lethal. As you know, the figures that we had from China, a lot of people were very, very scared by these figures. But if we're looking at what we had in France, or what we had actually in the Western world, the figures were like dramatically higher. So, of course, we had divergent figures, we have divergent behavior, we had divergent culture. So a lot of people were saying, for example, that in Asian countries, a lot of people were already wearing the mask and all these type of things. We also had question regarding whether or not the virus will disappear with a warmer weather. And to that, we also observed that we had many, many different responses. We had many, many different trade-offs that were made. But considering all the uncertainties that we're having, what were the appropriate measure? And Was it required to prevent the virus to enter into the country, like we need to close the border, or to prevent the spread of the virus, to use masks, lockdown, quarantine of the people who have been contaminated? Or should we just concentrate on the consequences of the virus, and just, for example, increasing the number of respirators, increasing the number of beds in ICU, investing in research development for vaccine, or these type of things? And actually, if we're looking at what happened, we discovered that different countries made different trade-offs. That some countries just used a very, very preventive approach. Some other country used a very, very reactive approach. So, for example, and of course, there were also some other trade-off, because the trade-off between, for example, the economy and the lockdown. If you're looking at what is happening, for example, in Dubai, the trade-off is, okay, we know that the virus will enter into the country. We're just going to limit the risk that the virus will spread, for example, and we are going to have strict rules regarding that. If we're looking at Pakistan, Pakistan just said, anyway, we do not have any money, so we cannot prevent anything. Just take your precaution, or these type of things. And of course, these different measures could be explained by these different trade-offs and the different resources also that the country had. They could be explained also by political systems. Like everybody knows that, okay, China can lock down a full city and forbid all the citizens to get out. I'm not sure that it would be possible in France, or that it would be possible. And what I would like to say also is that it depends on a risk culture. And if we're understanding this risk culture, we can understand the difference in regulation between the different countries. We can also understand why the political reaction to the different measures were different. And that's what I would like to address. This idea of risk culture is just to say that when we're facing a danger, the opinion will necessarily differ on how to regulate that danger. If you're thinking, for example, about cigarettes, if you're thinking alcohol, if you are thinking a virus, if you are thinking, I don't know, drugs and all these things. And when I'm saying that opinion will differ, it's not only on whether or not we need to intervene, but also on how we are going to intervene. Like some people are going to say, like if you are going to the Netherlands, a lot of people are saying, well, this legalization of some drugs actually is making complete sense for us because we're considering that people can do whatever they want. If you are going in France, of course, you are having a very, very different approach of things. If you are going to the USA, again, a different approach. And Douglas, in 1982, developed a very, very interesting things to classify risk culture. And she was classifying that according to two criteria. The first one is that when I'm looking at a country or when I'm looking at an individual, because once again, this is something that could be used for the risk culture regarding one individual or for the risk culture regarding a full nation. And you have one parameter, which is group. And the question is just like how much a person's decisions are based on their ties to the community they live in. So basically, the idea is whether or not there is some form of allegiance to the group, whether or not the people are considering that there is a form of a social solidarity, whether or not, for example, you are going to have nationalism or some other form of community that will exist. And of course, if we are having low group, we are going to have an individual society. If we're having a high group, we are going to have, most of the time, an hierarchical society, or it's at least a possibility. And to this group dimension, she's adding a greed dimension. And the greed dimension is just saying like whether or not you are constrained in your decision, like whether or not the individual are constrained in their decision, either because we're having many, many social norms, or we are having many, many other type of rules. And of course, the more I'm going to be constrained, the more hierarchical the society will be. And the less I will be constrained, the more libertarian the society will be. Of course, that does not mean that it's possible to have absolutely no social structure and no constraint. So we are just looking at ideal T, of course. And according to that, it's possible to identify 4 different types of society. Of course, once again, these are like very, very like approximation, of course. It's purely theoretical, but it's possible to say a lot of things out of it. And it's possible to identify the fatalist. So high grid, low group. Low group, low grid, so the individualist, basically a libertarian society. Low grid, so I'm not being constrained, but high group, I'm sharing almost the same value as the others, and you are going to have an egalitarian society. High group, high grid, you are going to have a hierarchist society. And what I would like to say that, of course, depending on the type of risk culture, you're not going to regulate in the same way regarding the virus. For a fatalist, the danger will occur and nothing can be done about it. Like, the virus will be here. The only thing that we can do is to build resilience. What does it mean? In a fatalist society, the only thing that we can do is what? It will be to target the consequences and try to mitigate the consequences. And if you are looking at what happened, for example, in Pakistan, because this is still what is happening in Pakistan, or if you are looking at what happened in one of the poorest states in India, Bihar, this is what they said. They said that anyway, we can't do anything about it. So it's up to the people to decide what they are going to do. And then it will be God's will, in a way. The individualist society will be something totally different, because we're going to say that each individual should be responsible for himself or herself. Why? Because we're going to have very, very different preferences. So anybody can do whatever they want. We will advocate for self-regulation. We are considering that self-regulation is the key. We are going, of course, to criticize any form of strict intervention. And of course, the typical example would be the USA under Trump. Of course, it changed a lot with Biden, but that was just that. Like, and you're a citizen, you know the risk, deal with it. And actually, for the USA, it's possible to say that it was both fatalist and individualist, because a lot of people, actually, when the virus was announced and all the things, just bought guns and other type of stuff in order to survive. So that was quite interesting. Egalitarian society will have another approach. They will have, like, they are going to consider that they are actually free to choose, in a way, because we're in a low grid society, but we're also in a high group society. So each individual is really considering that they are belonging to the group. So they are going to make their choice based on what are the needs of the group. So from that point of view, they are going to use some preventive measure, not only for themselves, but also for the group. And they are going to consider that solidarity is one way to deal with a different problem. From that point of view, of course, if I want to deal with the virus in an egalitarian society, probably I will just use recommendation, probably I will just use soft law, probably I will not impose very, very harsh constraints. And this is exactly what happened, for example, in Sweden. And then we can wonder whether or not Sweden was egalitarian or is still egalitarian, since they are considering, or they enacted a lockdown quite recently. The last type of society is a hierarchist society. And the idea is just that it's possible to control the virus. The only thing is that we need to make good decisions. And of course, good decisions should be made by the people who know, and the people who know are the experts. So we are going to give the power to the expert to determine what we should do. What does it mean also, and that's quite interesting, hierarchical society, most of the time we are going to blame the deviant, like the we knew about it. That's the case in China. And actually, when I was writing this presentation, I not discovered, because I cannot say discovered, but yeah, France is fairly hierarchical society. Few consequences of that. The first thing is that, of course, despite its limitation, it offers this distinction regarding risk culture, offer tons of insights regarding the different reaction to the regulation or the different regulation that were enacted. Like, it's impossible to understand the Swedish regulation if we're not understanding the Swedish risk culture. It's not possible to understand what happened in France or what happened in Germany, for example, if we're not understanding that. It's not possible to understand what was happening in South Korea or Taiwan if we are not understanding also the risk culture in these countries. So it's also possible, I believe, and this is something that I would like to see, to look at the type of regulation that were enacted to infer the type of risk culture in a country, which could be something that is, well, I believe that it could be something relevant to then anticipate what they are going to do if this type of problems occurs again. Of course, this national risk culture is not explaining everything, and there are some other parameters to take into account. That's pretty clear. But what it means also, if we're taking, for example, the USA, or a very a society that is multicultural, but for example, you are having cluster of different people with the same preferences in different parts of the countries, we can wonder whether or not it would be possible to regulate these different subgroups differently. But that's just something that I am considering. And the other thing that could be interesting is to see whether or not this national risk culture will evolve. Like, for example, the USA are very individualist at many levels. Are they going to turn into a more hierarchical society after the virus? Or in France, we were already hierarchical. Are we going to be even more hierarchical? So that, consequence number one, and a consequence that I believe is interesting. The second consequence is that because risk culture is different, we cannot fully compare the type of regulation and the results of the regulation between two different countries. Because of course, the people are going to behave very differently. And the risk culture will lead to very different consequences. And obviously, if we were in France copying what was happening in Sweden, it would have been something that would have been dramatic. What does it mean also is that it's very difficult to judge the relevance of one strategy, because behind that strategy, you are having some trade-off based to the risk culture. And of course, we are going to impose, in a way, our trade-off to another country when we are judging the result obtained by this country. And the that is interesting is that probably, if we are looking at the evolution of the different regulations that were enacted during this crisis, it's possible to wonder if the risk culture is not having an impact on the way the different measures were enacted. Because of course, when you're intervening and there is a political intervention, you are going to be criticized if you are overreacting or underreacting. It's possible to prove that most of the time you have a tendency to overreact, and it's in a way better to overreact than to underreact, because it's easier simply to justify. But you're also considering the acceptance of your regulation, and this acceptance of the regulation will necessarily depend also on the risk culture that you are having. If I'm looking at the different debate that occurred regarding the regulation under COVID, most of the time, I was not necessarily thinking this idea of a risk culture. Most of the time, this was a parameter that was not considered. And at least in France, when I was looking at the debate regarding the best regulation, it was like purely hierarchical. And we were not considering like the possibility to have other type of risk culture. Once again, this is parameters that is not explaining everything, but I really believe that it's explaining a lot. And I'm wondering if the risk culture is not linked also to some other parameters. For example, I don't know, the way we are drafting a contract. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Régis. Welcome to Alberto and François-Xavier, who are in charge of the next sessions. We are a little bit late, but I suggest we have some discussion about the two presentations we've just had now. I was, I mean, when I was listening to Régis, and I put the reference in the chat, I was thinking about a book from Jonathan Wiener, who, by the way, is a friend and of Fidesz. He edited a very interesting book, which is called Policy Shock. Or the subtitle could be regulating in crisis, and there is a comparison between the US and the EU in certain kind of risk regulation, especially in the in the chemical industry and things like that. And what is interesting is, to a certain extent, the two the EU and the US have a lot of social, social factors which are very similar. However, the legal framework do not put the same way on the same risks. Or to put it briefly, for a US citizen, there is no problem in having, their chicken washed with detergent before going to the supermarket, whereas they are totally frightened and shocked when they see that the Paris underground opens its sliding doors before stopping. So there is even in societies where, and this is of course is much more, it's very precisely documented with a lot of empirical studies and statistics used and things like that. So I have another reaction to Régis, and then I will give the floor to the rest of the people. I mean, your point is very interesting as regard comparative law, because what is interesting in the current situation is that there are a lot of comparison on the measures taken against the pandemic. A comparison between the legal measures taken in France, in Germany, in Sweden, and things like that. But I believe one of the biases from of these studies on comparative studies is actually the way these regulations are enacted and enforced.